Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are on listen-only mode. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, please disconnect at this time. And a quick reminder, we will have a question and answer session at the end of the call. If you would like to ask a question over the phone, you may do so by pressing star, then 1. And now I would like to turn the meeting over to Ms. Megan Murray. You may begin.
Hello, and welcome to everyone who's joining us here today. I'm Megan Maury, a senior advisor here at the U.S. Census Bureau, and I'm joined today by my colleague Alexandra Kraus from our Population Division, who's one of the leaders on our census data products. We've got additional census staff on the line, including Cynthia, Jason, Nicholas, Rachel, Deb, and a number of others to help answer your questions throughout today's webinar. And just a reminder that any views or opinions expressed today are the presenter's own and don't reflect the views or opinions of the U.S. Census Bureau. So I just wanted to set the stage for a few minutes about today's webinar. Our focus today is on the Census Bureau's proposals for our upcoming data products, the Demographic and Housing Characteristics File, or DHC, and the Detailed Demographic and Housing Characteristics File, which sometimes people refer to as a DDHC. Alexandra is joining us here today to walk folks through the crosswalk or the visual representation of those proposals. And to set the stage, I just wanted to make sure that people were aware that way back in 2019, we actually released a crosswalk at that time, a proposal at the time of the tables we were intending to publish for the DHC and what level of geography those tables would be published at. That proposal back in 2019 was based on a pretty robust analysis that had been done inside the Census Bureau of things like what our internal data users made use of most from the decennial data products, what tables people downloaded most from our externally facing websites, and also, of course, the constraints of the different algorithms we were using for our disclosure avoidance system. At the time in 2019, we received quite a lot of feedback from you all, our data users, about that proposal, especially from some of our most expert data users who told us about how they use the tables, what tables they were sort of most accustomed to using in their work, what geographies they were most accustomed to using, and how that did or didn't align with the proposal we had put forward. That feedback was enormously helpful. It helped us identify what was for us some new information, including just new ways that the data were used that we weren't aware of before receiving that feedback. So we really appreciated that feedback at the time, and that has helped inform our thinking about the decisions we need to make in the near future about our data products. We also got some feedback from y'all back in 2019 about the crosswalk itself. We heard that data users let us know it was a little bit tough to navigate and that it was hard to know kind of what data would be available in what data product. It was a little bit difficult to identify changes. And we took in all that feedback at the time as well. Since 2019, we've heard even more from our data users about how they use the data. And we know that our data users have learned a lot from us as well about how the disclosure avoidance system that we're using for 2020 works. So with all that feedback and that learning in mind, as we move closer to that point when we need to make decisions about what data products we'll be publishing and at what geographies, we wanted to republish that crosswalk and get more feedback from you all from those who want to provide it to us. So to close the circle a little bit, the feedback you all provided back in 2019 and how that feeds into where we are today, we took your feedback both on the crosswalk itself and on the data products. So on the crosswalk itself, you told us you needed help understanding how to navigate through that crosswalk. That's what today is about. My colleague Alexandra here will walk you through the crosswalk. We'll give you a bunch of tools and tricks to better understand how to use it. But we also integrated new tools into the crosswalk itself to make it easier for you to navigate. So hopefully with the information that Alexandra provides today, it'll be a little bit easier to make it through. We also heard from you back then that you needed more information about what would be in data products that are coming after the DHC, or the Demographic and Housing Characteristics file. So in this crosswalk that we've published now, you'll also see the proposals for other data products. Again, Alexandra will walk you through those today. And I wanted to just reiterate a little bit more about the substantive feedback that you've provided to us back in the day. If you provided us with a use case back in 2019 telling us how you used the table, don't feel as if we didn't hear that. We heard your feedback. We made some changes to the proposal that you'll see today, and we still have that feedback on hand. We have a robust list of use cases that we were provided back in 2019. But why we're reissuing this crosswalk and asking for additional feedback right now is we know that some people have evolved in their thinking since the feedback that they gave us back in 2019, and we want to make sure to capture that evolved thinking in your feedback today. For example, maybe as we shared more about reconstruction re-identification studies, you learned about the risks to reconstruction and re-identification posed by low level of geography data or single years of age, and that's made you rethink the feedback you gave us in 2019 about what tables you think are most important to publish and what levels of geography. Or maybe you've learned more about how the privacy loss budget was allocated, and you've come to a different place around what you think are the priorities for allocation of that privacy loss budget for the DHC, the Demographic and Housing Characteristics file. If your thinking has evolved, we'd really like to hear about it. So as Alexandra walks you through today, it's an important thing to keep in mind about how to find the information you need in order to give that feedback about how your thinking has changed. And of course, if you didn't give us feedback in 2019, we wanted to make sure that people had a really robust opportunity to give us feedback now. We want to hear from you. Of course, one of the most useful things for us is use cases. We, especially at low levels of geography, how you use the data at the block or the block group level, for example, and especially where you're in a tough spot without the data. Like let's say your local housing authority is required to use decennial data to make decisions about housing, or if the census is really the only source for the particular data point that you need to do your work. Those kinds of feedback are especially helpful to us, but we want to hear anything that you have to say. So we will, again, be taking feedback from you. We'll let you know towards the end of the webinar where to submit that feedback to us. But hopefully today's webinar will give you a much better sense of how to look through the documents we've provided to help you give that feedback most effectively. If you have questions as Alexandra goes along, feel free to throw them into the Q&A. We'll try to answer them as we go. We'll take additional questions and answers at the end. And with that, I toss it over to my colleague, Alexandra. I can't wait to hear this walkthrough.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks for joining today. First, I'm going to overwhelm you with a lot of information by going through every single tab in the 2020 Census Data Product Planning Crosswalk and all the columns. And that just goes to show how much data we really are planning to release. After that, hopefully I'll provide some tips, some examples of how to navigate the crosswalk so you can really go into the crosswalk and know how to answer a question that you might have. So let me switch over to the crosswalk now. Okay, so here we are. This is the crosswalk. The purpose of the crosswalk is to show you what we're proposing to include, all the data we're proposing to include for the 2020 census, and compare that back to the 2010 census to see the differences. So we're going to start out here on the README tab, the first tab. And up here on this tab, you're just going to find some background and some contextual information, what each product is comparing back to. You'll see the pre-decisional watermark on every tab, but we also have restated here, table content and lowest level of geography may change based on analysis of data quality and the privacy accuracy trade-off. So this really is a proposal, and we really are looking for your feedback. Next, there's some information on what you can get from the table number. For example, part of the table number
tells you what the lowest level of geography for that table. But no need to memorize this. We also have a column in the crosswalk that gives you that information too. In addition, the table number can also tell you if the tables are repeated by race and ethnicity. And again, no need to memorize those labels if you don't want. That information is actually in the title of the table. Now, if you've already downloaded the new crosswalk, you might notice your crosswalk doesn't have green highlight and mine does. And that's because I put green highlighting on here to kind of help you follow along with points that I'll be talking about. I might also just try to click and drag to bring your attention there. So as I mentioned, as I go through each tab, I'm also going to bring up some major changes since the previous version of the crosswalk. No need to take notes on that. We also have a tab at the end of the crosswalk that's a change log, and it goes through all the changes from the previous crosswalk. But we'll first start here where the green highlight is. You'll notice these are new iterations compared to the previous crosswalk, iterations J through AH. Those were added to 3 of the DHC tables. Now, for the rest of the crosswalk, we're going to be talking about 4 data products. That's the redistricting data, which was already released, the demographic profile, the demographic and housing characteristic file, and the detailed demographic and housing characteristic file. Each of those data products has 2 tabs, which is 8 tabs in total. And the first tab for each data product is going to be a list of table titles and then comparing that back to 2010. The second tab for each data product is going to be the 2020 table shells or proposed table shells, which is going to show you, all the information that's included in that table shell. And then, as I mentioned, at the end, you'll see the change log. So let's go ahead and get started with an easy example, the redistricting data. Only 6 tables, and we've already released this. So some of you may have already started working with the data. I'm going to go through each column and just make a mental note that these columns are the same across the data products. So the first column is the 2020, our proposed 2020 table number, and the second column is the 2010 table number. If you see an NA, that means it's not being proposed for 2020 or it was not published in 2010. So for example, here we have group quarters population by major group quarters type. It has an NA for 2010, indicating that this table was not produced in 2010 for this data product. The next column, of course, is the table title. If the table title has changed since 2010, you'll see the 2020 table title here, but most of the titles are the same. The next column is the lowest level of geography for 2020 or the lowest level of proposed geography for 2020. And then the next column is the 2010 lowest level of geography. This is a new column that we added compared to the previous crosswalk, which makes it a little bit more user-friendly. And you'll kind of see some of those sprinkled like throughout the crosswalk. This allows you to easily compare. And again, if you see an NA, that just means it's not proposed for 2020 or it was not published in 2010. Then the final column here, it just tells you yes or no if the table is proposed for inclusion in 2020. Of course, you can get that by looking at the NA in the first column, but here's just kind of an easy way to see that. So now, if you're looking at a table, let's say occupancy status, and you're not quite sure what all that includes, you would want to go to the second tab, which includes the table shells. So here I can see occupancy status. It includes total housing units, total occupied units, and total vacant units. And this is exactly what the table would look like on data.census.gov. So you can scroll through and look at those table shells if you want to see that level of detail. So let's move on to the demographic profile. Of course, the demographic profile has not been released. So now we're talking about our proposals for 2020 for the rest of the data product. For the demographic profile, as I mentioned, you see the same column, but here you start seeing NAs in that first column, which indicates these tables are not being proposed for inclusion in the 2020 demographic profile. If you come to the end, proposed for inclusion in the 2020 demographic profile, you'll see no again, but you'll also notice that we are proposing to include that in the 2020 detailed DHC. So if you wanted to see more about those tables, you would come down here to the bottom and navigate to the detailed DHC tab. If you go over to the table shelves to look at more of these tables in detail, you would not see those tables that are not being proposed for 2020 demographic profile. You would only see the ones that are being proposed for inclusion. So again, here you just see those table shelves once you're ready to look at it in more detail. Okay, now we'll move on to the demographic and housing characteristic file, or the DHC. This contains a lot more information, but again, you're going to see the same columns, but now you have two additional columns. First, you're going to have proposed for inclusion in the 2020 detailed DHC. We included this here for a few reasons. One, some of the tables overlap between DHC and detailed DHC. This is because in the DHC, you're going to see that base table, and you might see those iterations A through AH. But in the detailed DHC, some of those tables are iterated by the detailed race, ethnicity, tribes, and villages. And so you can easily see that here. For example, total population is proposed for inclusion in the DHC and the detailed DHC. Now, in addition to those detailed iterations, there's some tables that we were planning on proposing in the DHC, but they got moved to the detailed DHC. And for that reason, when you get to a table like that, you will see no in the DHC column, but yes here. So that's just an easy way, you know, if you see the table and you realize we're not producing that data, you can easily tell we're producing that data in a different product and not dropping it altogether. And then the other new column on this tab is major content changes since 2010. Now, what we did for this column was we looked at that 2020 table shell, the proposed table shell, and we compared it back to the 2010 table shell. We looked line by line, and we indicated any major changes. So you can see if that table has lost or gained granularity in the information that's being provided. I'll go over a little bit more of how to use those columns in a bit, but first, before we move on, I would like to point out some major changes since the previous crosswalk. So here we have Hispanic or Latino origin by race, total races tallied, and you'll see we're now proposing to include that down to the block level, which matches 2010, but it is an update from the previous version of the crosswalk. And also based on data user feedback, we added in the 4 race and ethnicity tables from the PL back into the DHC. Again, this is the same as 2010 census, but a change from the previous version of the crosswalk. Another major change you'll see here is we dropped one of the GQ tables because it was redundant with another table. You could already get that information there. So we streamlined that a bit. And again, if you're interested in seeing a specific table, then you would hop over to the next tab, the DHC Tables tab. Here, I've already scrolled down about over halfway for us to just make a note about this table and a major change from the previous version of the crosswalk. This is group quarters population in non-institutional facilities by sex, by age. Here, it used, in the previous version of the crosswalk, it started at under 15 years, and now it starts at under 5 years. In the previous version of the crosswalk, it stopped at 65 years and over, and now it stops at 85 years and over. So we made updates to 5 of the GQ tables where we added more age granularity, and then this is more similar to the 2010 census. So here we reverted this table just right back to what it looked like in 2010. So that's another major change that we made in the table shells. So you've probably heard a lot about the redistricting data, the demographic profile in the DHC. We've had a lot of outreach on that, but we have made substantial progress on the detailed demographic housing and characteristic file, or detailed DHC. And so the crosswalk was the first time that we're unveiling this work and the proposed tables. So let's go to that crosswalk. Here you will see the same columns that we talked about before, and it also crosswalks back to the DHC, the proposed DHC, for the same reasons I mentioned before, which some of these tables, there is overlap, and then some of them were bumped from DHC to detailed DHC. You also have a new column proposed to be iterated by detailed race, ethnicity, and American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages. So you can also see that there. Looking at this crosswalk as a whole, you'll see these are the 12 tables that we are proposing to include in the detailed DHC, and the rest have the NA. One thing that's a little tricky about this tab is the comparison point. So when we were looking at the redistricting data, that was easy because we were comparing the 2020 redistricting data back to the 2010 redistricting data. Same thing for the demographic profile, 2020 demographic profile back to the 2010 demographic profile. When we were looking at the DHC, we were comparing back to the 2010 Summary File 1, or SF1, as the DHC is the predecessor for that file. Here, we are comparing back to Summary File 2 in the American Indian and Alaska Native Summary File. And if you didn't know, those two files, SF2 and AIAN-SF, are actually just a subset of tables from the SF1, and the purpose of those products was to provide those detailed iterations. So that's why we're comparing back to SF2 and AIAN-SF. One caveat is, of course, these 8 tables which were bumped from SF1 or DHC into the detailed DHC, and that's why for these 8 tables, you'll see SF1 in this column because we're comparing back there. And then in addition, we are still developing the detailed DHC, but we did want your preliminary feedback. And so you will see some to be determined on this crosswalk. For example, for these complex person household join tables, the geographies are still to be determined. And there's actually something a little bit unique about the geographies in the detailed DHC. Compared to all the other products, we talked about lowest level of geography, which means we include that table at the geography listed and any geographies larger than that. Here, for detailed DHC, instead of picking the lowest level of geography, we just pick exactly which geographies we want to produce. And so that's why here you actually see a list of geographies instead of just lowest level of geography, meaning that geography in all levels above. In addition, for the tables iterated by detailed race and ethnicity, we will have thresholds. 2010 also had thresholds, and those thresholds are to be determined. And the final iteration list is also to be determined. And so let me just double check. I told there's a lot on this tab. And then another thing that I actually wanted to go through at this point was we've gotten a lot of questions about what makes these complex person household join tables unique to some of those other tables in the DHC. So In the DHC, you might find a table that, appears to be a complex person household join table. And the difference here is that the DHC had the underlying data that produces it is two files. We have the unit or the household file, which contains household characteristics. Then we also have the person file, which contains person characteristics. And we can no longer merge those in the DHC. And so what we did as a workaround to be able to still include some of those tables in the DHC was we created flag variables, which would basically become a household characteristic. So for example, instead of having the count of people age 65 and over, which would be the count of people inside of a household, which would require that person household join, we instead made it into a flag, presence of people 65 and over. So that becomes a yes, no, and that becomes a characteristic of the household. So we were still able to produce a lot of those tables in the DHC. In the detailed DHC, it really is the count of people in those households. So an easy way to kind of see this in the crosswalk is actually going to the detailed DHC tables. And one thing you can kind of tell for a lot of these tables right away is the universe is population and household. But if we're just looking at this part, the bottom part of the table shell, you'll probably see a table shell that's similar in the DHC. The difference here, though, is that in the DHC, you would be getting counts of households, so counts of married couple households. Where in this table, because we're in the detailed DHC and in the universe is population and household, you'd be getting a count of people who live in a married couple household. So hopefully that kind of helps explain the complex person household join a little bit more. And then, of course, like I mentioned, the last tab is the change log, and that provides the 2020 data product table that has changed, and then comparing that to the 2010 data product in table number, table title, the change from the previous crosswalk, and then the final column change from 2010. As I alluded to earlier, sometimes we just reverted it back to 2010. And so it's no change from 2010, but there is a change from the previous version of the crosswalk. So we made it through the full overview of every single tab and every single column. The main takeaways there is just knowing all those columns, what you can do. You can compare levels of geography. And also for the detailed DHC, a few things to take away here is that we're comparing back to SF2 and AIAN SF, except those 8 join tables. And then when you get to DHC and detailed DHC, you also can compare against each other in addition to 2010. And then, of course, in the detailed DHC, we still have some to be determined. So the table or the crosswalk tabs give you the list of tables, kind of more the high level, comparing back to 2010, whereas the table shells really show you the detail of the proposed 2020 table. So now that's a lot of information. You're probably not going to need to go to every single tab, every single column. And so now I'm going to try to show you some examples of how to navigate the crosswalk. For this, I'm going to go to the DHC crosswalk tab because the DHC includes all the data released in the PL or the redistricting data and the demographic profile. It also has that column comparing to the detailed DHC. So this is a great tab to show you everything that we are proposing to include. There's a few different ways that you can look and investigate in this crosswalk. I'm going to go over a few, but sometimes it just takes a little investigating yourself, and there's multiple ways to do these different things. So let's start out with the major content changes since 2010. Let's say you know the tables that you're interested, you just want to see if they've lost or gained granularity. So you can use this filter option, you just select it down, and then you can deselect no, meaning no content changes since 2010, and then deselect NA, meaning the table is not being proposed for 2020 or was not published in 2010. Press OK, and now here you can see the list of tables with their changes. And once you take out those iterations, there's actually not that many that have changed. So let's look at households by type and presence of own children under 18 as an example. If I read the no, it provides a high-level summary of what that change was. So it says change presence of people under 18 years to presence of own children under 18 years. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Probably don't need to do any additional investigation with that explanation. But the next comment is collapsed age detail for children under 18 years. You might be really interested to see how that age detail collapsed. And so if you wanted to take that additional step, you would identify the 2020 and 2010 table number. The 2020 is P17. You would go find that table shell on your tables tab, find P17 here, and I've already highlighted that collapsed age detail. Next, you would identify that 2010 table number, which was P20, and you would go find that table in either data.census.gov or the 2010 Summary File 1 technical documentation, and you would just compare that table side by side. Of course, I've already done that for us today, and what you would find is that in 2010, it used to be children under 6, children 6 to 17, or both. And now it's children under 18. So if you want to see the detailed change, you can always do a cross comparison there. Sometimes, as I mentioned, granularity was added. Sometimes it was just changed based on questions, changes to the questions. But now if you want to go back to the whole crosswalk, you can select your filter option again, select all, press OK, and that's going to take you right back to the full crosswalk. Another thing that you might be interested in is seeing how the geography changed from 2010 to 2020. We know that some of those block level tables got moved to higher levels of geography, and so you can come to the proposed 2020 lowest level of geography and unselect the options. Block, of course, is the lowest level of geography, so we don't want to check that. I notice there's no block group tables, and so I'm going to start with tract. I see there's only 4 tables being proposed for 2020 at the tract level, and when I looked at that 2010 column, they are all also available at the tract, so no change there. So I could go to the next geography up, county, and here it looks like there's a lot more, so to make it a little bit simpler, I'm also going to filter the 2010 lowest level of geography and deselect county, because that would be no change between 2010 and 2020. So once I do that, I can easily compare which tables went from block to county, or if I scroll down, tract to county. And again, once you take out those iterations, it's not as many as what it seems here. Then I will want to select all, press OK, do that on both columns this time to get back exactly where I was, where I can see the full crosswalk here. Another thing that you might be interested is, where did we drop the table? What data was I able to obtain in 2010, and I'm no longer going to get that data? So you could go to Proposed for Inclusion in 2020 DHC, filter that to No, meaning not proposed for inclusion. And then here you can see those tables. If we look at the first table here, it's P16 iterated A through I for populations and households by age. Because this starts with an iteration instead of that base table, which would just be P16 by itself, that tells me that we are still offering population and households by age, but we're just not offering those iterations or not proposing to include those iterations for 2020. And then if I go to the next one down, which I have highlighted in green, I see P17, average household size by age. And although it says no, not proposed for inclusion in 2020 DHC, if I go to the next column, I can see that it is being proposed for 2020 detailed DHC, and the iterations for those tables are to be determined. So for me, I might not care which data product the table comes in. I just really want to look at tables that we're dropping all together. So I could go to proposed for inclusion in 2020 detailed DHC and also only select no. And then here, this gives me the full picture of the tables that that are not being proposed for inclusion in 2020. I should mention that these tables were dropped for a variety of reasons. Some reasons include redundancy in the table. You can get the information elsewhere. Outdated concepts, such as related children. Concerns about accuracy and the privacy accuracy trade-off, as well as DAS limitations. Now that I've kind of showed you how to answer your question or filter through this information using the columns, let's go through a little bit by topic. You might only be interested in a certain topic, and so you're really just trying to find that topic in the crosswalk. First, I'm going to go and get myself back to the full crosswalk by selecting all, so there's no longer any filters. First, let's go through an example for sex by age. You could search sex by age and find those tables, or you could just look through the table titles, scanning down until you find one. And the first one we'll see is P12, sex by age for selected age categories. Maybe I'm not familiar with that table, so I can go over to the table shell tab, search for P12, and see what those selected age categories are here. If I go back to the crosswalk, I notice it's proposed at the block level, no change from 2010, and I notice there's no changes in table content from 2010. So I can keep scrolling. I'll see all the iterations for sex by selected age categories, so I'll get out of those. And the next table I see is median age by sex. Again, no change from 2010. That, might find that table pretty straightforward, so I don't have to look at it. There's also sex by age for the population under 20. Again, no change from 2010. And if I keep scrolling or scanning through these table titles, through all these iterated tables, my next table I'll find is sex by single year of age. And again, no change from 2010. So I could continue to do that through the tables. The rest of the tables will include sex by age for households and GQs. So now maybe I'm interested. I know the relationship question changed for the 2020 census, and maybe I'm really interested in looking at data on same-sex spouses and unmarried partners. One way I could do that is select the crosswalk, and I could just search same sex. I get an error message, nothing found. So now I maybe try it with the hyphen just to make sure. Okay, again, an error message. This tells me that there's no tables that have same sex in the title. So now I'll probably go over to the table shells, assuming that that would pop up over here. So again, I'll search same sex. Error, no, nothing found. I'll add in that hyphen. and I see the table pop up. If I press Find All on this window, it's going to show me a list of everything that meets that search criteria. And so this first table that I see here is P19, household type by relationship, and I see the counts of same-sex spouse and same-sex unmarried partner. I can use this to easily get through my next options, and the next option brings me down to PCO 19A, the same table, household type by relationship for people who are white alone. So I know this is an iterated table. It looks like the base table is available at the block, and here it's available at the county. So I can look through, and now I see I am hitting all these iterated tables. So I'm going to scroll down in the findings bar to try to get out of those. And I'm finally at I, PCO 19I, and my next instance of same-sex is PCO 26, coupled households by type, and then I can see this table also includes that information. If I keep going, the next instance of that is just a data user note. And so that might be one way of how you can find data relating to same-sex specifically. Let's go through another example. This one's a little bit more tricky. Let's say I'm interested in data on children. I know children's not always going to pop up in the table title. For example, we looked at sex by age, and that's not in the title. And I also know even if I look at the table shells over here, children's not going to always pop up, similar to the sex by age table. So Megan actually showed me this tip that I thought was really nifty. And so if you search for under and go to Find All, this might not be exhaustive, but it will give you a really good idea of the data that we have on children. So again, you can just look through this list, and here I see I got to the iterations, P12A, so I can keep going until I get out of that iteration list. This is one of those tables that's A through AH, so it's going to take a while, and then once I do, I can look at the other tables here. I won't go through this full list because we actually have a lot of tables with that information, but I'll stop with the examples there. And so what I did was I provided an overview of every tab and column so you know at least have an idea of what's included in the crosswalk. But you're likely going to have a specific question or a specific thing you want to look at. And so I've provided you with a few examples of how to navigate the crosswalk. Hopefully next time you open the crosswalk, it won't be so overwhelming, and you'll have some tips to get you started, and you can find new tips along the way. So now I'll pass it back to Megan, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Every time I hear you talk about this crosswalk, I learn approximately 30 more things about it. So I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that. Loved all of your examples. We do have quite a few questions in the Q&A. I can tell right now we're not going to get through all of them. So what we're going to focus in on is questions that are about the crosswalk in particular. There are many questions in the chat that are a little bit more technical questions about the functioning of differential privacy, but for today, we're going to really focus in on this crosswalk. And I think one of the questions I see kind of repeated in different iterations is, let's say I care about a particular geography, like block group. How would I find all the tables that have block group data? Is there a kind of an easy way to look for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the redistricting, the demographic profile, and the DHC, we provide the lowest level of geography. And so you might need to look at a resource that shows the geography hierarchy if you don't already know. But here we know that block is the lowest level of geography that census provides. And so that would include all the geographies above that. And so for block group, that would be included in all the block level tables. But if you were interested, in tract or county, you could filter that here. Another thing that I could mention is one update that we made was how we organized these tables. And so before it was organized by 2010 table number, and now it's organized by the 2020 table number. And we start with population tables available at the block level, lowest level geography block. And then we go to tract and county. And then once we get to our age tables, we do the same thing. And then at the end is where all those NA tables are. And so you can either use this column to filter, or you can just follow along the table title and know that these are all going to be blocked until the column changes to tract.
Oh, great. That's such an easy trick. And a great reminder, too, that if something's published at the block level, it's going to be published at all those geographies above it, at least for this tab, the DHC crosswalk. You did mention that's a little different for the DDHC, where you'd want to look in that column, particularly for the exact geographies that we're proposing. So that's super helpful. What about geographies that people think of, for those that have been following along with the DP conversation, they think of them as off-spine geographies, but geographies that aren't sort of those traditional census geographies of block, tract, county. Like, what about place, for example?
Yeah, so for place data, if it's tract, block group, or block, you will get the place level data. But once we get to the county and state tables, place level is not being proposed for inclusion in those. And again, it just kind of goes, you have to be able to add up that information. And so tract is the highest level of geography that would also include place in MCDs.
Yeah, and something I think I didn't completely grasp until I started working at the Census Bureau is that nesting of geographies. So that really helped me understand why those off-spine geographies, those like sort of not traditional census geographies, are kind of adding up to other components of the geography. That's really, really helpful. I'd say the next most common question over here in our Q&A is on timeline, and I know we've got some other folks on the call as well who might be better to answer this, but the questions people are asking are generally, do we have a set date for when the DHC, the Demographic and Housing Characteristics file, will be published? Do we have a set date for the demographic profiles? Do we know the sort of order of operations, which file comes before which other file? Alexandra, I'm not sure if you want to take that or if Cynthia wants to hop on and give people some info on those timeline questions.
Yeah, I think Cynthia would be great to answer that question. She's done a lot of work with the schedule. She's been presenting that.
That'd be great. Cynthia, do we still have you on?
I am on. Can you guys hear me?
Sure can.
Awesome. Yes, we are getting quite a bit of questions around the schedule. And while we have not finalized the release schedule, we don't have hard release dates. Again, we have outlined a lot of the major activities to get us to the DAS implementation, to make sure that we're tuning the DAS to provide fit-for-use data, particularly on the demographic profiles and the DHC, and where we have that tentatively set for next year. Again, once we finalize the implementation, we can further flesh out the release schedule where we would provide some more definitive dates. Again, right now our target is next year, late next year. I want to make sure we get posted to the website for not everyone that were able to see Jason and I's presentation on the actual schedule, and we'll make sure we get that posted. But we did recently post a blog that talks about where we are in terms of DAS development. It's imperative to get the feedback that we're asking for now, because that helps us as we continue to move forward on implementing the DAS, and that also helps us identify release dates that we can actually stick to. In the meantime, we will continue to update the data user community and the public on our plans, but unfortunately, I don't have hard dates to put out right now, other than to say that we are planning at least 2 demonstration data products where we can show how the DAS is being implemented, gather feedback, make sure we're tuning properly so that we can provide fit-for-use data. So you will have other opportunities to weigh in on where we are. And I want to speak specifically around the tuning for the demographic and housing characteristics file, as well as the demographic profile. For the detailed DHC, for which we are collecting feedback, we are continuously working on that schedule as well. So while we want to ensure we hit every piece of the process where we are engaging with the public, getting feedback, and making sure that we are planning for providing fit-for-use data for everyone's, we'll do our best, for everyone's use, I just can't commit to a release date right now.
Yeah, and I have 2 follow-up questions for you, Cynthia. One is, well, I guess more of a statement than a question, which is that I really liked when I was listening to your last presentation on the timeline, which I really encourage people to check out if they haven't had a chance. I liked that the way that you showed the timeline, we're taking feedback at sort of before every decision point, right? So like as the sample data comes out, we take feedback, then go into those decision points, right?
Correct. It is an iterative process, and making sure that we are hearing from the data user community, ingesting, digesting, assessing, and making decisions based on what we're hearing. And that will help us get closer to an actual release date.
Yeah. And I mean, also the sample data is not all we'll be asking feedback on too, right? So like right now we're asking for feedback on the crosswalk. We will of course ask for feedback on that sample data. But there'll be other decision points along the way. Is that
absolutely right? Absolutely. So we want to make sure everyone is aware they will have ample opportunity to weigh in on the direction we're moving in. So we want to make sure we continue to be transparent. Yes.
Fantastic. And speaking of feedback, when is the deadline for feedback on this beauteous crosswalk, and how do they submit it to us?
Awesome. Alexandra, do you want to take that, or you want me to take it? Right now we're looking for feedback by October 22nd, and we are taking feedback at our email address, and I believe it's 2020-DAS@census.gov, and we'll post it in the chat to make sure everyone is aware. I'm sure we posted in the chat even the link to where we first made the announcement and how to get to the crosswalk directly, but the 2020 DAS email inbox is the one that you should use.
Great, thank you. And there will be additional opportunities to give feedback again past that October 22nd date. We just wanted to open up and ask for more feedback on this crosswalk right now. So thank you so much, Cynthia, for all that wonderful timeline information. I really appreciate it. Jumping into a couple of other questions in the Q&A, there are a couple of questions that ask about, can we have data by, let's say, zip code or metro area or those kinds of things? Are those proposed for publication? Are those the kind of geographies we're talking about when we talk about these census geographies?
When we talk about what did you say?
The census geographies that are in this chart. Should people be looking for the kinds of geographies like zip code or metro area? How should they think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not as much of a geography expert as a data product expert. Does somebody else on the line want to talk a little bit more about some of the geographies that these off-spine geographies?
Hello, it's Jason Devine. I think I can help answer that question. Can you hear me? Thanks, Megan.
Sure can, Jason.
think that's one of the things that we would like to explore expanding in the crosswalk is currently we have these different levels of geography listed, like the lowest level being the block or the tract level or the county level. And Alexandra started to get into that a little while ago, but I think something we could do would be provide some supplemental information so you could see exactly what geographies are included when we say, for example, the lowest level is the tract level. Because if you look at the way it's proposed right now, if something is proposed to the lowest level as being the tract, there's actually quite a few other geographies that would be provided along with those tract level data, and then also, usually think of it as a hierarchy, up through counties and then states. But there's also a lot of other geographies that are kind of included along with tracts. And then also for the block level, it's not just up through that hierarchy, it's also a lot of other geographies would be made available. That maybe that's something we could look at expanding to make the crosswalk even more useful than it is at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that. And I do know that there were some other sort of iterations of this same kind of question, but I think one specific I wanted to kind of get into is there was a question that said, in the places in this crosswalk where it says geography TBD, what kinds of geographies would it be helpful for folks to recommend for those? Like, should people be thinking about those off-spine geographies like places or zip codes, or should they stick to those block group, tract, county geographies that we think of as the census geographies?
Yeah, if you're wanting to provide feedback on some of the geographies proposed for inclusion in the detailed DHC, of course, definitely think about the block group, tract, county, state, and nation. You also might want to think about the place MCDs, and also the American Indian and Alaska Native Hawaiian areas. I think that those would be some key ones to think about and consider, but of course, we're always happy to take feedback on anything that is important for your work.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a great point. For all feedback, even when we give guidance on, this particular type of information is especially useful for us, I really encourage people not to think of that as limiting. We would love to hear your feedback back on anything, and if you give us feedback like, I use this data at the zip code level, we've got a lot of expert geographers on staff who can help translate that into the census geographies that would be necessary for your use case. So please don't think of it as limiting. We really do want to hear all of your feedback regardless of what it is. And then if we have time for we are actually at time. I'm getting the nod that we're at time. We saw other questions in the chat. We did try to answer as many of them as we could, but we really do have a lot more information about this crosswalk, about the timeline, about the data products in general, and the differential privacy system in particular on our website, www.census.gov. Just so you don't have to look too hard for it, if you type disclosure avoidance into the chat, it will come right up to the page that has a lot of information available to you right there, all on one page, huddled in one place, including information about how to submit feedback on this crosswalk and a link to the crosswalk itself. We really do want to hear from you. Alexandra, any last words you want to make sure people walk away with today?
Yeah, definitely thanks for coming, and I hope that, the crosswalk isn't as overwhelming. You can dig in and start to answer some of your questions, and those that are unanswered, always feel free to reach out to that email, and we can try to help find the answer for you.
Excellent, and don't forget, the email is 2020-DAS, that's D-A-S, at census.gov. We cannot wait to hear it from you, and thank you all for tuning in today.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect this time. Speakers, please allow a moment of silence and stand by for your post-conference.